this is Misha, and this is part 2 of our FAL video, and this is looking at the L1A1 and L2A1, so-called inch pattern. In my hands is a British L1A1, often called the SLR for self-loading rifle in Commonwealth countries like Britain and Australia. And this was made by DSA, Birmingham Small Arms. As I said in the first part of this video, first part of the FAL video, I should say, Britain was interested in the FAL in 1948, and they even requested that FN chamber it for their .280 intermediate cartridge. Even going further, they even wanted FN to make a bullpup version, both of which FN did. However, in around 1951, 1952, Britain decided to go with its own domestically grown M2 bullpup firing, the .280 cartridge. So it looked like FN wasn't going to get Britain as one of its contractors. Now it's worth noting that after the liberation of Belgium from World War II, FN offered free licensing of the FAL to the Allies who helped liberate the nation as a free gift. But since it looked like Britain wasn't going to do it, that's really what opened up the door for FN agreeing to the USA to rechamber it for the .30 caliber light rifle cartridge, now known as 7.62 NATO. Well, Winston Churchill came back into power, and he overturned the decision for the M2, and he pushed forward for Britain to adopt the FAL. So in 1953, right after the rifle went into full-scale production, Britain ordered 5,000 as trials rifles. I believe they were called the XAE1. Now, just about a month after that, that was in December of 1953, a month later, Canada ordered 2,000 trials rifles. So both Canada and Britain were trying out the FAL in early 1954. Well, actually, Canada would beat Britain to the punch, and they would officially adopt it that same year as the C1. And then later, in 1955, or maybe late 1954, Britain would adopt it as the L1A1. However, it wouldn't go into full-scale service until 1957. It took some time to tool up and to phase. Now, the British L1A1 has several differences from the original metric pattern, if you want, FAL. These early days, a lot of changes were happening. FN was perfectly happy to accommodate the desires and the requests of its customers as long as they were reasonable. So starting at the muzzle, we have a long birdcage flash hider with a bayonet lug on the bottom. This is actually similar to what is called the Type B flash hider, except it would have the kind of flatter bayonet lug similar to what's on the Israeli, and the key would be at the top instead of the bottom, but that's for another day. We still have a 21-inch medium to lightweight profile barrel. Front sling swivel here. Still have the tall front sight, which was standard in the early days when these were first being in service. Have the short stroke gas piston under here. We have a folding carry handle. The shape is a little bit different. As you see, there's no ridges on the top, finger grooves, and it's a little bit bulkier, blockier. The lightning cuts on the British guns are a little different. Moving on. The rear sight is the same, but it also folds. This was done for storage and also to be used with scopes. The British used what is called the suit scope, so that was done to make it easier. You can't see inside, but the dust cover has, well, you can see the edges here. But there are two small tabs that bump up against the receiver that keep the dust cover from going too far forward. That's actually a holdover from the original style of dust cover, which was cut back here and could be topped off with stripper clips. Britain would never use that style, however, Canada would use it on the C1 and later the improved C1A1. So the Canadian guns are probably the most famous users of the stripper clip guides, although most of the early FALs, like the T-48 prototypes in America, in the early Belgium M1s, would still be capable of being topped off by stripper clips. Flipping this critter around, we have an enlarged selector, or as the British called it, the change lever. Safe is up here, semi is down here. These were semi only, the L1A1. Self-loading rifle. We have a vertical takedown lever. This is a later style that has kind of a pyramid shape that's punched out as a single piece. We have a folding cocking handle. Folds up so it's out of the way. One of the biggest differences, let me show you here, the mag release is actually moved over. It still has the same pivot point, but it's moved over to the left side. So you can drop mags very easily. The so-called inch pattern mags, unlike the metrics, have this large plate in the front, horizontal bar, which honestly locks into the receiver more securely. Also, the floor plate is different. It has this lip here. Probably a more stable design. Metric mags will fit in the L1A1, the inch pattern, but not as securely and probably not ideal. Now, something else that's interesting, these do not have an automatic last round hold open, but they still have the automatic switch, the switch here for it that you can use as a manual hold open, like that. But if you pull it back, it'll record. You could put a automatic hold open in there, the only difference is a small pin that connects to the magazine. And finally, the trigger guard is actually hinged right here, and if you remove the screw here, you can fold the trigger guard into the pistol grip, and this was done for using with the winter mittens, cold weather gear, that kind of thing, just to have an enlarged trigger guard. Now, originally, these would come with walnut furniture, but later it would be replaced with this, which is this black, but it's called marinil. This was a nylon fiberglass mix, very durable. It has a kind of a checkered pattern to it. I really like this furniture. It's neat, it's unique, and it doesn't feel quite like polymer or plastic. It is definitely its own thing, but it's very durable. It also had interchangeable butt plates. They had small, medium, and long sizes to set the length for the soldier. Now, the wood ones would also have a storage compartment for a cleaning kit, but the marinil ones would not. Instead, they would use a belt-style cleaning kit. But these would be produced in Britain starting around 1955, 1956. They would be made by DSA, obviously. They would also be made by FAL and Infield. And later, Parker Hale would make small parts after main production was over at the standard factories. But Parker Hale would not make complete guns. This was officially adopted, went into standard service, blah, blah, blah. In 1957, the Infield was declared obsolete. This was still in standard use during the Falklands War in 1982, and would be started to be replaced in 1985 by the very famous SA-80 or L85A1, but that changeover didn't get completed until 1994. The SLR was very well liked in the British military. It was reliable and durable, although by the 80s it was starting to have the same problems as other FALs in service. It was long and heavy. This one seems a little bit lighter than the Israeli thanks to the marinil furniture, but still it is a very long and heavy gun by the standards. We've just got 20 round mags firing 308. Speaking of that, because of all the back and forth between the US and Britain and FN, these ended up being in 7.62 NATO, not .280, unfortunately. The FAL is a great gun in 308, 7.62 NATO. Yes, I know the two are not exactly the same, but that's a story for another day. But in .280, it would have been a fantastic rifle, but that didn't happen. Anyway, this was the L1A1 made in Britain. In 1958, Australia would also adopt the L1A1, and in 1959, licensed production would commence at Lithgow. And Lithgow would make them through 1986, and it would produce about 223,000. And this would be phased out in Australia by the Steyr AUG, at least a licensed version called the F88, also made at Lithgow. The Australian L1A1 would see extensive use in Vietnam by Australian and other soldiers. It would also be purchased in relatively large numbers by New Zealand and other, Pacific Rim type nations. Australia would make a version called the L1A1 F1, which had the short butt stock, and it had a shortened flash hider, and it was about 2 1/4 inches shorter, and it was done for small stature soldiers. In Canada, it would be made by Canadian Small Arms Limited, which was formerly Long Branch. Production would begin there in 1955, and Canada has the distinction of being the first nation to officially adopt the FAL, although other nations looked at prototypes before then, but they adopted the C1, and later they would adopt an improved version called the C1A1. It was very similar to the L1A1, but the details were a little bit different. For example, the wood furniture, the pattern was a little different. The flash hider was a little bit bored out for better accuracy, things like that. Also worth noting, while I've got it in my hands, this one has the later style 3-slot flash hider, which was introduced for durability. The early ones would have a 5-slot, which we'll get to in just a minute, with a different rifle. And to go with this L1A1, Britain, of course, had a bayonet. This is it here. Very conventional, pretty short, handy little bayonet, I guess. It's hard to put these on rifles while you're sitting down, though, because the rifles are so long. Maybe. There we go. So it's hard to do when you're a foot ahead. That's a 1A1 bayonet. The pre-ban, there was only the Poirier pre-ban L1A1As came in from Australia. They were imported by Poirier, as I said. Also, Onyx imported some receivers from Australia, as did Eden. There were no pre-ban Canadians or British, though. This British gun came in the 90s for police use as a Title I firearm, and then these were sometimes sold off as surplus, as officers were allowed to buy them. So there are very few British-made, ATF-approved Title I L1A1s in the USA, made in Britain, but they're all surplus-type guns. They weren't new when they were brought in, and then, of course, the police officers also used them, so they have some honest wear and tear, but I think it just adds to the attractiveness and shows that this one actually went there and did that. But the inch pattern FAL is very interesting. A lot of times the assemblies are interchangeable with metrics, but sometimes the smaller parts are not. So just something to be aware of if you pick one up. Just look at parts compatibility. But I really like the British L1A1. It might be one of my favorite FALs, in fact. We'll move on. Well, to go along with the L1A1, there was also the L2A1, which was the FALO version with the heavier barrel and intended for use as a light machine gun. As you see here, we have a wooden handguard, wooden stock. What's interesting about this, and this is a very kind of heavily modified version of the FALO, is the handguard doubles as the bipod. So I was trying to get the sling to right in between. I've got the sling cinched up enough, but it's being ornery. There we go. So this is the L2A1. I'm really glad that barrel's not hot right now, or I would be screaming. Now, these were not used in Britain. Instead, Britain used what they called the L4A1, which was a Bren gun rebarreled to fire 7.62 NATO. However, Australia and Canada would use the FALO. In Canada, it was called the C2, and then the later improved version was called the C2A1. In Australia, as I said, it was called the L2A1. There was just the one version. This was actually kind of a joint project between Canada and Australia, as Australia didn't, or I should say Lithgow, did not make all the parts. But starting at the muzzle, we have the original 5-slot style flash hider, which Lithgow always used. We've got a heavy profile barrel, still 21 inches though, because it's exposed here. You can see just how large it really is, exposed gas tube. The front sight base is interesting. These ears are actually removable, with screws, so if they get damaged they can be pulled off and replaced. Canada would also use this pattern on the late C1A1s as well. Still the long stroke gas piston. The carry handle is a little bit different. The shape is very similar, but it's canted forward a little bit, as you see, again to help with the balance point. Probably the biggest difference, aside from the barrel itself, is the fact that we have a tangent sight mounted on the dust cover of the L2A1. Now, I've been told that these dust cover sight assemblies were made in Canada. I don't know if Lithgow actually ever made them or if they just brought them over from Canada. It doesn't really matter, I suppose. The early C2s used this as well, but the C2A1 went to a disc-type rear sight mounted here, which was just like a C1A1 rear sight, except much larger. It's quite a large disc for the 700 meters versus the 500. Still have wood furniture. Lithgow would not go to the Marinil. They would continue using wood. Otherwise, pretty similar to the British pattern. There we go. So has the folding charging handle here. Same type of mag release and bolt hold open, manual bolt hold open there. Have a vertical takedown lever here. But yeah. Now it's worth pointing out that these did feed from 30 round mags. These are inch pattern 30 rounds, and that they did issue these in Australia as well as Canada. It will still, of course, feed from the 20 round inch mags as well as the metric mags. Lithgow would begin L2A1 production in 1962, and they would carry it out through 1982 in relatively small batch runs here and there. They would make just under 10,000. Now, most would go to the Australian military, but some did go to New Zealand and other, business partners. So a few did go outside of country, but most of the 10,000 stayed in Australia, and a lot of them were used in Vietnam along with the L1A1 SLR. Some in Vietnam were even cut down. They would cut the barrel down here. They would remove the bipod and put standard handguards on, or they'd use a grenade launcher. And the Australian soldiers would call this the bitch rifle. There's quite a bit out there on the internet about them, but it was definitely kind of a field ad hoc thing, never officially done. But it's the only kind of variant of the L2A1 that existed, even if unofficially, and it was just done in the field by special operations and the like. These would also be the squad automatic weapon in Canada, the C2 and C2A1, until the 80s. They would be eventually replaced by the FN Mini-Mag and the C9 in Canada. But it would be a squad automatic gun. Much like the Israeli heavy barrel, it had its pros and cons and really wasn't a great squad automatic gun like machine gun. It was alright, but it wasn't great. This whole bipod notion is kind of neat. It did save on weight. I mean, instead of having a big heavy bipod hanging off like on the Israeli, you've got one assembly here that's only a little bit heavier than a handguard. Another benefit is when it's down, your barrel's completely exposed and can air cool faster. At least that was the idea. I mean, it should cool very quickly here. But I think you see the problem. If you need to pick up and move your rifle, you have to grab the bipod leg. But if you forget in the heat of combat or even training and grab the barrel, well, yeah, you get the idea. I assume that every man issued with an L2A1 or C2 did that one time and learned real fast. It seems like it would be a very steep learning curve. Anyway, this rifle here is a really nice kit built by a friend of mine over at Honey Creek Industries. It's on a DSA Lithgow pattern receiver. The lightning cuts on the Lithgow are kind of distinctive, different from the British and Canadian. Let's see here. In the 80s, really the only pre-ban L2A1s were ones built using kits and Eden or Onyx receivers. It's been said that Poirier imported a few pre-ban L2A1s, but most of those were actual full auto registered machine guns. There were a very, very tiny number of semi-autos. I don't have numbers in front of me, but I think it was less than a dozen. It might have even been 7. But I know there is a tiny number. So if you see a pre-banned Australian receivered L2A1, chances are it was an Onyx or even import and was built from a kit. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just pointing out that they didn't import many of these in large numbers. No one ever imported the C2 or C2A1. And so if you find those, and there was just one on Gunbroker last week that sold, and it was definitely a kit build. I think it was on an Enterprise receiver. But it's okay. These are rare enough as is. The kits are, they only made about 10,000, and several were lost in Vietnam. So it's a relatively rare kit gun. But I always wanted one of these. I just thought it was a really unique take on the FALs because of the bipod and the rear sight especially. So something to be mindful of there. And it's a semi-auto range gun. It's really, really fun. But yeah, that was a look at the inch pattern FALs. And if you have any questions, let's post them below. Or if you just want to chat FALs, let's do that. This is Misha, and we really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.